The constraints of one's own character can only be explored so thoroughly before a sense of repetition sets in. It was the summer of 2008 in Westport, Connecticut. Paul Newman, a legendary figure of the silver screen, was confined to his bed, patiently enduring the ebb and flow of his physical discomfort. Each afternoon, he would instruct that a Panasonic tape recorder be placed beside his pillow. This was not for capturing life reflections or crafting a documentary. Instead, it was for a confession, one that no one could have possibly foreseen. 6 clandestine romantic entanglements he'd shared with some of Hollywood's most celebrated leading men. There was one who had held his hand through the darkest hours, professing eternal devotion, only to later betray him by secretly forwarding a love letter to a tabloid journalist for financial leverage. Another had meticulously recorded their private conversations, threatening exposure should Paul ever speak out, promising to paint him as a delusional fabricator to the entire industry. The question then arises, who were these individuals? And why did Paul choose to keep these profound secrets concealed until the twilight of his life? The first name Paul Newman uttered on that recording was none other than Marlon Brando. Their connection, as revealed, was a deep dive into desire and sorrow. Their initial encounter took place in 1961 at a charity gala hosted at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. Paul arrived with his wife Joanne Woodward, exuding his characteristic poise and composure. Brando, fashionably late, entered in a rumpled shirt, his gaze a peculiar blend of impish amusement and cool reserve. He remained standing behind Paul for the remainder of the evening. When he finally spoke, Brando remarked, "I expected you to be as dull as the press portrays you." After a brief pause, he added, "It appears you're the only genuine person here." That night, for the first time, Paul, who typically remained aloof to effusive compliments, did not deflect. From casual meetings over coffee in Westwood to late-night strolls around Silver Lake, and even impromptu secret excursions to Palm Springs that remained unknown to anyone else, a bond began to solidify between them, a connection difficult to categorize. Paul's affection was characterized by profound sincerity and a deep emotional investment. Brando, however, did not reciprocate this level of intensity. According to Paul's recorded words on August 3, 2008, Brando viewed love as merely another role to perform. He would extricate me from my comfort zone, thrusting me into unfamiliar social circles, perplexing situations, and scrutinizing gazes I couldn't navigate. The venues Brando selected for their meetings were often remote estates in Laurel Canyon or temporary residences in Venice Beach, invariably populated by directors, reporters, producers, and veiled promises of future film roles, accolades, and fame. Initially, Paul perceived these as mere social gatherings. However, he eventually recognized them as carefully constructed backstage dramas orchestrated by Brando, where all attention was focused on Marlon, with Paul serving as a peripheral figure kept close only for his utility in bolstering Brando's public profile. Even more distressing was Brando's act of leaking details about Paul's handwritten correspondence, words of tenderness, trust, and vulnerability to Mark Weller, a freelance photographer who regularly supplied stories to the Los Angeles Mirror. In 1965, the publication featured an anonymous column titled "Love Behind the Lens," which alluded to a celebrated actor, a recipient of the Venice Award, torn between his domestic life and a clandestine relationship with a dark-haired screen luminary. The implication was clear to everyone. The subject was Paul. Paul himself was unaware that it was Brando who had left the envelope at the newspaper's reception desk. The motivation? Brando's craving for public attention, the need for his name to be circulated, and the desire for old photographs and past narratives to be resurrected, ensuring that the name Marlon Brando remained perpetually in the public consciousness. And Paul, the man who had loved him and trusted him, ultimately paid the price for Brando's insatiable hunger for relevance. The situation became even more agonizing for Paul when Joanne, his steadfast wife, discovered a copy of that letter tucked away in a drawer of a bookshelf. She offered no commentary, but left him a poignant note. "If you need refuge, I am still here. However, if you require another deception, I am unable to assist you." A somber period followed in Connecticut. Paul remained largely indoors for weeks. His daughter, Nell Newman, recounted how her father would often awaken in the dead of night, quietly slip out to the back porch, and smoke alone in the chilling air that numbed his hands. While no one directly inquired, the unspoken understanding permeated the household. In one of his final recordings, Paul stated, "I once believed that with sufficient patience, with prolonged affection, I could inspire him to change." But Brando remained immutable. His sole skill was transforming genuine emotions into instruments for self-preservation. He continued, his voice softening, "And I allowed him to fashion me into such an instrument, even when I knew I didn't warrant it." Then his voice dropped akin to a mournful sigh. "I loved him in a way that no one should ever love another." The narrative between Paul and Brando did not conclude with a confrontation or a parting. It dissolved into silence when Paul ceased responding to calls, stopped writing letters, and abandoned the belief that love could transform an individual. Yet, the pang of regret persisted, and not everyone who inflicted pain upon Paul simply departed. There was another man who entered his life not as a romantic partner, but as a tempest of possessiveness and authority. This was a man who, after initially championing Paul, later utilized that very support as a means of absolute control. That individual was Steve McQueen. Consider Robert Redford, a love shattered before millions. In 1969, Hollywood was captivated by the Western allure of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Critics lauded it as the quintessential on-screen pairing of two men. Paul Newman portrayed Butch, embodying charm, intellect, and cunning. Robert Redford embodied Sundance, radiating coolness, sharpness, and an undercurrent of menace. However, few were aware that during the final days of May, while filming in Zion National Park, Utah, a separate narrative, far removed from the script, was quietly unfolding once the cameras ceased to roll, a clandestine romantic affair. At that juncture, Paul Newman was 44 years old, residing with his wife Joanne Woodward in Connecticut. Robert Redford, a mere 32, was married to Lola Van Wagen and the father of 3 young children. Both were established family men. Yet, an inexplicable and subtle attraction emerged between them, compelling them to seek each other out. During cast meals, they would discreetly anticipate the next scene, cherishing the opportunity to stand close, brush shoulders, or simply hold each other's gaze for a moment longer than usual. According to Dennis Corbin, a member of the lighting crew, on a weekend evening while the cast was staying at a lodge in Springdale, Utah, he observed Paul standing outside Redford's balcony at midnight, a cigarette in hand, his eyes visibly red. "I didn't inquire," Corbin recalled, "but I witnessed Robert open the door, pull him inside, and then they were gone." This, of course, was not an isolated incident. From 1970 through the early 1980s, the two men led parallel lives, renowned co-stars by day, secret lovers by night. Only one harbored the belief that their connection was genuine. The other was determined to bury it. In a recording dated July 14, 2008, Paul confided, "We both had wives, children, reputations, but I loved him with a feeling that defied any definition. I continuously believed that if I maintained my silence, if I waited with sufficient forbearance, there would come a time when he would clasp my hand in the light of day as he did in the darkness." That day never arrived. In 1976, Paul intended to confide the truth to Stephen Close, a journalist from The New Yorker, who had published an extensive feature on him the preceding year. At the Algonquin Hotel in Manhattan, mere hours before their scheduled meeting, Paul received a telephone call from Robert Redford's representative. "If you utter a single word about this," the message conveyed, "you will forfeit everything." That very evening, Close received an anonymous fax accusing Paul Newman of mental instability, substance abuse, and an alleged physical altercation with a female assistant while intoxicated. The interview was abruptly canceled. Paul's career began to falter for reasons that remained publicly unexplained. A few weeks later, a tabloid in Palm Springs, the Daily Star, published an article alleging that a veteran actor had been ostracized by a former colleague due to perceived violent tendencies and emotional instability. Although no names were explicitly mentioned, the implication was unmistakable. Robert, the very individual Paul had once mentored and supported, maintained an absolute silence. At the 1980 BAFTA Awards, during a rare direct inquiry, a BBC reporter asked, "Do you still maintain contact with Paul?" Robert responded with studied composure, "We created something remarkable together, but everyone must eventually move on." He then turned away, declining further questions. Paul, in response, returned home, opened his personal journal, and penned a trembling entry. "The man who once hailed me as his guiding light now uses me as a shield for his public image. He not only repudiated me, he fractured the authentic core of my being, the part I would never dare expose if not for him." That love did not cease with a separation. It concluded with a carefully orchestrated silence, a silence that endured until the coffin was closed. One might have assumed that Redford represented the ultimate extent of Paul's heartbreak, but this was not the case. The subsequent individual Paul named was a young man who, at the tender age of 24, had moved a nation to tears, a wild, incandescent spirit whose life was tragically cut short. Do you have an inkling as to his identity? 3. Steve McQueen, when love became a conflagration that consumed them both. Steve McQueen, that scoundrel. Paul Newman uttered the words, each syllable laden with the weight of a lifetime's accumulated resentment. This was not born of a singular remark or a solitary transgression, but rather the fury stemming from years of manipulation, subjugation, and absorption by a love that was both intoxicatingly passionate and suffocatingly toxic. Their initial encounter transpired backstage at the Photo Play Awards in 1956. At that time, Paul was already a married man, while Steve was an emerging talent, cultivating his reputation through minor television roles. However, the intensity of Steve's gaze directed at Paul, defiant, unguarded, and imbued with a sense of possession, made it impossible for Paul to disengage. Their brief encounters soon evolved into clandestine meetings that stretched for hours at the Chateau Marmont Hotel. Paul once confessed in a recorded statement, "I once believed he adored me. But then I realized he simply needed to demonstrate that even Newman could be his to possess." When Confidential magazine published a rumor in 1962 suggesting an unusually close relationship between Steve McQueen and a male actor in New York, Steve's reaction was swift. Within a week, he was photographed hand in hand with Anne Margaret at the premiere of The War Lover. Concurrently, Paul was presented with a non-disclosure agreement by Steve's legal representative. "You understand the consequences for those who are exposed, don't you?" Steve whispered as he proffered the document. "You have a family. You have a daughter. Do not let it all crumble simply because you are too fragile." He didn't merely threaten. He systematically eradicated all traces of their connection through financial means, legal maneuvers, and clandestine media contacts. On one occasion, Paul discovered evidence of a payment exceeding $15,000 from Steve to an editor at Variety, stipulating that Paul Newman's name be permanently omitted from an investigative piece that was in development. However, the most devastating blow was yet to come. In 1965, during an appearance on the Merv Griffin Show, Steve smirked when questioned about rumors of a male admirer. He responded, "I don't recall his name. Likely some overly enthusiastic fan. The sort who sends love letters and appears uninvited at my residence in the middle of the night. Quite unsettling, really." Paul overheard this remark and understood its implication. Steve had not merely attempted to erase their past. He had reduced it to ashes and force-fed those ashes to another. On a separate occasion, when they encountered each other backstage during the filming of The Towering Inferno in 1973, Paul exclaimed, "Why did you portray me as a madman to the entire world?" Steve merely chuckled, opened a drawer, and produced a cassette tape. "A mere precaution," he explained. "Should you ever utter something you shouldn't, I will possess the means to counter every word." He had secretly recorded every private conversation, every argument, every declaration of affection, every moment of vulnerability. Steve retained these recordings as a personal arsenal, ready for deployment should Paul ever betray him. When Steve married Ali McGraw in 1973, Paul remained silent. However, a few days later, a package arrived at Steve's residence. Inside was a torn shirt that Steve had worn after a night of heavy drinking at Paul's cabin in Vermont. The blood stains, the lingering scent of alcohol, and the lipstick marks were all still present. This was not a memento, it was a final ultimatum. Paul's voice fractured in one of his recordings. He weaponized affection, he stated. Every embrace inflicted another wound, and yet I couldn't resist returning. I still loved him, even knowing he would be the one to destroy me if I allowed him even an inch closer. And then, as if fate denied Paul even a moment of respite, the next man to enter his life was his polar opposite, Robert Redford. Gentle, warm, affectionate, akin to a melancholic melody. And yet, this connection also ended in treachery. For James Dean, the confidant in the doomed night in Mexico. For Paul Newman, James Dean represented not the most sensational love affair of his life, but the one that inflicted the deepest wound. It was a love that began with admiration, blossomed into a profound connection, and culminated in a heartbreak that he carried to his final days. They met in the spring of 1955 on the cold concrete floor of the Warner Brothers studio lot. Paul, then 30 years old, was starring in Somebody Up There Likes Me. James, a mere 24 at the time, had recently achieved stardom following the success of East of Eden. By all accounts, they should have been rivals, but the initial look James gave Paul was devoid of any competitive spirit. It was filled with awe. Then came a smile that kept Paul awake for 3 consecutive nights. Their meetings became more frequent, sometimes in a quiet booth at an all-night diner along Ventura Boulevard, other times on aimless drives in James's brand-new Porsche 550. There were afternoons spent in a rustic cabin in Idlewild, reciting lines from La Boheme, pretending to be fellow actors rehearsing. But in reality, every word spoken was an unspoken confession of love. One rain-swept evening, after the premiere of Rebel Without a Cause, James confided in Paul, "I don't need anyone to comprehend me. I only require that you be genuine when you are with me." Paul offered no verbal response. He simply took the young man's hand and placed it over his chest, where his heart was pounding. But life rarely permits beauty to endure undisturbed. That June, an unknown paparazzo named Eddie Prescott captured a photograph of the two men embracing through the window of a parked car near Sunset Strip. No publication dared to print it outright, but mere days later, the gossip column, Shadow Lovers of the Silver Screen, in the Los Angeles Herald Express, sent shock waves through Hollywood. While no names were explicitly stated, everyone understood the implication. James was immediately dropped from his promotional contract with Warner Brothers, and Paul lost a role in a George Stevens production. The industry's reaction was even more severe. One production executive faxed Paul directly, stating, "If you wish to avoid the fate of Montgomery Clift, you would be wise to instruct your wife on how to display public affection." James was devastated. He began to distance himself from Paul. Calls went unanswered, and letters remained unreturned. One night, Paul appeared at James's residence and knocked for hours. No one answered the door. Only a small note, wedged in the doorframe, written in a trembling hand, was visible. "I do not deserve to live if existing in your gaze is wrong." 3 days later, James was hospitalized following an overdose of sleeping pills. He survived, but the press showed no leniency. Some publications, such as Daily Variety, ran headlines like, "Young actor suffers severe emotional disturbance." A columnist for the New York Post wrote with chilling detachment, "James Dean should learn to be a man before aspiring to be an idol." Paul was equally distraught, caught between two worlds. On one side, his fame, career, and home life with Joanne Woodward. On the other, a love slowly succumbing to despair. He was uncertain how to save James without dragging them both into ruin. In September of that year, James sent Paul one final message. "Mexico City, Friday. If you do not come, I will understand." Paul did not go. At that time, he was in New York preparing for a photo shoot with Life magazine alongside Joanne. He held the plane ticket in his hand and even reached the airport at LaGuardia, but he turned back, overcome by fear, by weakness, by a lack of courage to dismantle everything he had meticulously constructed. Then, on September 30th, 1955, James Dean perished in a tragic automobile accident in Cholame, California. The news broke during CBS's 8 o'clock radio broadcast. Paul heard it while in the living room of the Plaza Hotel listening to the radio. He neither ate nor slept for 3 days. In a recording from the summer of 2008, Paul recounted, "I sat gazing at my hands. They were steady. Not a tear fell. Only one question echoed in my mind. Why didn't I board that plane? Had I gone that day, would he still be alive?" From that moment forward, Paul Newman never spoke James Dean's name in the presence of others. However, family members revealed that when he had consumed alcohol, he would often gaze at the ceiling and whisper, "I apologize. You were meant to live a brilliant life." And until his final years, Paul kept a faded handkerchief in his nightstand drawer, the sole memento from their last excursion together to Edelweiss. 5. Salo, a youthful affection suffocated by societal judgment. At that juncture, Paul Newman was little more than a man shattered by his experiences. Outwardly, he maintained an air of elegance, a public persona of the quintessential American husband. Internally, however, he had collapsed. Following his entanglement with Steve, he had plunged into an abyss of self-reproach. The man who had once possessed the capacity for silent affection now perceived deceit, violation, and manipulation in every interaction. In September of 1974, Paul sought the counsel of a psychologist in West Hollywood, discreetly recommended by his wife Joanne, who had consistently chosen empathy and forgiveness. He spoke little, murmuring only, "I am profoundly weary. I require a space where I can find solace." It was there, on a rain-soaked afternoon, as somber as ash, that Sal Mineo entered his life. By that time, Sal had long since retreated from the limelight. After Rebel Without a Cause, he had once been hailed as a second James Dean. However, due to his striking resemblance to James, he also shared his tragic fate, being sidelined by the Hollywood establishment for his excessive sensitivity, his perceived fragility, and his authentic nature. Furthermore, whispers concerning his sexuality contributed to his marginalization. "Are you also undergoing treatment?" Paul inquired. Sal nodded, then lightly tapped his temple, not to address an ailment, but to counteract what they instilled in me as an illness. From that point onward, they began taking walks together following each therapy session. There were no embraces, no kisses, no attempts at seduction. They were simply two solitary men, each striving to navigate a world burdened by extraordinary pressures. On one occasion, Sal scribbled a note on a small piece of paper and discreetly slipped it into Paul's jacket pocket. "If they brand you a pariah, then let me be one alongside you." Love arrived gently, like a soft exhalation, unhurried and not feverish as it had been with Steve, nor as intense and consuming as with Brando. Instead, each morning, Paul would discover a handwritten note left by his door. In these notes, Sal had written, "Did you sleep well? I often ponder if you were to awaken one morning and I were no longer present, would you seek me out?" Paul once confessed that Sal was the first person who made him feel as though he didn't need to conceal his true self in his presence. He remarked, "I forgot that I was Paul Newman." They had made plans to travel to Venice together in the spring of 1976. S. harbored a desire to craft a cinematic narrative, a story for the two of them to inhabit, chronicling the journey of two souls who found each other amidst a city succumbing to the encroaching floodwaters. However, that envisioned expedition was destined never to materialize. On the evening of February 12, 1976, S. met a violent end, fatally wounded just outside his residence in West Hollywood as he was on the verge of entering, having concluded rehearsals for the play P.S. Your Cat is Dead. His assailant was an unidentified young man. The authorities initially characterized the incident as a robbery, but Paul understood it to be the inescapable consequence for a man who had the courage to live authentically. Upon receiving the devastating news, Paul entered a profound silence that lasted for 3 days. He abstained from all conversation, electing instead to sit on his rooftop, gazing out at the sprawling cityscape. Later, in a recorded message, his voice quivered with emotion. "I once believed I was the one providing him solace," he confessed, "but it was S who truly pulled me from the depths of despair. He never sought anything from me save for the simple courage to be myself. And I never had the opportunity to express my gratitude." 6. Montgomery Clift. A love that was both ultimate and a pain that could not be articulated. "I once held the conviction that nothing in this world possessed the power to break me. This unwavering belief shattered the moment Joanne stood before me, her hands visibly shaking, presenting a letter she had discovered tucked beneath my pillow. It was a handwritten missive from Monty, penned in a distinctive blue ink, his elegantly slanted script bearing his complete name. I had never before witnessed such profound devastation etched in someone's eyes. In 1966, while Paul was engaged in filming a picture in Tucson, Arizona, Joanne Woodward made an unexpected arrival on the set, appearing without any prior notification. In her hand, she clutched an opened envelope. There were no accusations leveled, no tears shed, only a stark, chilling declaration. "So this is why you haven't slept for the past 2 years." Following each of their clandestine meetings, Montgomery Clift would dispatch secret correspondence to Paul. These were not filled with tender professions of affection, but rather with poignant, tear-soaked outpourings of his soul. On one occasion, Monty penned, "I do not require you to choose me. My sole request is that you refrain from denying my existence." Joanne had read every single one of these letters. Compounding the distress, One of these deeply personal letters was discovered by a wardrobe assistant and subsequently fell into the possession of Clara Jenkins, a journalist affiliated with the National Enquirer. That November, the media world erupted in a frenzy. Headlines blazed across the front pages proclaiming Paul Newman and Monty Clift, the buried truth. 20th Century Fox swiftly issued Paul a formal summons, demanding an explanation concerning any extramarital involvements that could potentially tarnish his commercial standing. A mere 48 hours later, Joanne packed her belongings and departed their shared residence, leaving behind a single folded note containing a solitary pointed line. If you choose to live a life of deception, at the very least, do not drag me down with you. Paul was plunged into near madness, not due to the revelation of his secret, but because of his perceived failure to shield those he cared about. Not Joanne, not Monty, and certainly not himself. A few days thereafter, Monty contacted Paul from New York. His voice was laden with exhaustion, yet possessed an underlying resolve. "I am deeply sorry," he stated, "but I can no longer endure this. I have no desire to exist as a mere specter. I do not wish to remain your clandestine affair." Paul implored Monty to journey to Los Angeles, offering assurances that he would relocate, that they would embark on a new beginning, even suggesting they could go public if it became necessary. Monty, however, declined. Less than a month later, on the night of January 23, 1967, Paul received a telephone call from Kevin McCarthy, a close confidant of Monty. The voice on the other end of the line was choked with emotion. "Monty is in the hospital. He ingested a substantial quantity of sleeping pills. They were able to save him, but he is unwilling to see anyone, especially you." Paul's world completely crumbled. In the span of merely 4 brief weeks, he had lost his wife, his lover, faced relentless media scrutiny, witnessed the postponement of his contract for Cool Hand Luke due to personal matters, and was confronted with a lawsuit from Universal Studios for violating a moral image clause, demanding the astronomical sum of $1.2 million for that era. He quietly checked himself into a psychiatric care facility located in the suburban areas of Connecticut, using an alias. His medical records indicated a diagnosis of severe anxiety disorder, stemming from emotional trauma and nervous exhaustion, accompanied by a profound state of self-neglect. This period of his life remained entirely unknown to the public, as Paul compensated both his legal and public relations teams generously to meticulously erase all traces of his confinement. Within the private journal of his psychiatrist, Dr. Richard Hale, a document later leaked to the public, there was a single poignant entry. "He does not wish to live, yet he lacks the courage to die. It is the most terrifying existential state I have ever encountered." Monty did not wait for Paul to recuperate. 9 years later, on a frigid February evening in 1976, Montgomery Clift was discovered deceased in his West Hollywood apartment, a victim of a heart attack that followed a telephone conversation which concluded with a scream. He was gone, and I simply continued to exist, forever ensnared. At that moment, I did not grasp his hand. I mistakenly believed myself to be strong. Yet, in the end, I proved to be nothing more than a coward, capable only of loving. The recording ceased at that point. Not another word was spoken. And perhaps it was precisely for this reason that it became the most indelible and haunting fragment of Paul Newman's recollection. A man who had carried the burden of a doomed affection for half a century, only summoning the courage to vocalize it when his own life was nearing its final chapter. Paul Newman has since passed away, taking with him countless reels of tape recordings that were never once unveiled to the public. Within them lie buried names, intimate relationships, and profound emotional wounds, all resting silently in the obscured corners of a Hollywood that, on its surface, appeared dazzlingly glamorous, yet concealed countless masks and layers of profound deception. He once articulated, "I do not recount this story seeking absolution. I share it so that I may not be entirely forgotten." And now, you are the recipient of these final confessions. But have you ever paused to consider how much of this narrative is rooted in factual truth, and how much is merely the spectral echo of a soul engaged in a somber countdown to its last breaths? We encourage you to share your perspectives with us in the comment section below. Kindly remember to like this video. Please share it with individuals who have held affection for and admiration of Paul Newman, and subscribe to our channel to ensure you do not miss the subsequent installment.